an outgrowth of a discussion that we had at our curriculum committee meeting last month, I think, at the committee's request that Marvin give us an overview of what our district's testing plan looks like. And to say that it's our district's plan is really understating the fact that much of it is driven by requirements from the state, some that have been around for quite a few years, others of which are relatively new as part of the Common Core Standards testing and testing to support the annual professional performance review. And I think the committee wanted to get a sense, as we've been talking as a board about, is New York State over-testing? Is it not over-testing? To get an idea exactly how much time our kids are spending engaged in these tests, and to have a discussion that flows from that. But again, based on some of our conversations, Marvin and mine, we thought that this might also be a logical time to take some of our evening to take a look at what some of the data that these tests generate, which we typically do annually each spring. So we're kind of killing two birds with the proverbial stone this evening and trying to look at the actual data that's generated along with the overall testing plan. So some of this curriculum committee members have seen and heard some of it, but not all of it. Some of it's new to all of us around the table. So Marvin is going to kind of be the ringmaster here this evening, and that's appropriate since he really does have a wealth of knowledge about what's going on statewide in terms of assessing students, and has some I think very well-informed opinions that he'll be glad to share with us. And answer your questions as we need to. And we're not planning on being here till 10 o'clock tonight. We're kind of, no, seriously, we're kind of targeting something in the 2-hour or thereabouts range. We'll stay as long as you guys have questions or want to discuss, but it's easy to burn out on all this data discussion too, so we don't want to do that. I will just remind everybody that even though this is a special meeting / workshop, we are filming this for Panda and YouTube, so just be aware of the fact that we hope to use this tape to actually pass this information along to a broader segment of our parent population, our community population, via that format. So all of that nonsense having been said, I'll turn it over to Mr. Krebs.
And if I can just make sure everybody's clear.
Sure.
So Marvin, we've seen this style of data, this type of data. I think there's some new things in here that those of us not on the curriculum committee are going to be interested to see. So please do make sure you take the time that you need to linger on the stuff that's new. And I just encourage my colleagues, I'm not going to run this like a formal meeting, so if you have a question, just address Marvin directly, if that's okay with you, Marvin.
Please.
And we'll make this kind of fairly interactive. Okay?
Yeah, please.
Super. Way you go.
Okay. Well, I've sort of chunked this out into 3 separate chunks. I started to, Joe and I were talking about it might be a good idea to try to roll in the sort of update with regard to how the students did on student achievement did last year into this presentation, while I'm trying to help everybody get their heads around what the state education department is doing in terms of the Race to the Top application and the Regents Reform agenda. And at the same time, I'm trying to sort of facilitate a discussion here locally about, okay, how do we react to that? And given the state of educational policy, how our students seem to be reacting to that, how our professional faculty are reacting to that, how our administration are reacting to that. I don't know how well I'm going to do with this, so we'll see. I'm going to try to cover I put this into 3 separate buckets. The 3 buckets are, I'm going to try to cover the student achievement data, albeit in a truncated, somewhat rapid form compared to what I normally do. I prepared the same documents that I always prepare. That is a student achievement report, and then I do a slide deck. I have both of those. The slide deck I'm going to use here is a shorter, more truncated version of the longer one, which I'll make available if someone wants it. There's nothing secret about any of this. I just think in the interest of time, I needed to somehow or another try to condense it. We'll see how well I did that and still maintain some coherence. The second piece of it is I'm going to try to talk about the Regents reform agenda, because I don't think you can really respond meaningfully to the questions about assessment and how to react to the political environment that's going on, and a lot of the questions that are coming from the field to the State Ed Department, questioning the 3-through 8 testing, questioning the annual professional performance review of using testing for purposes of evaluating professional faculty and all of that. So it's hard to talk about any of this stuff separate from each other because it's all inextricably linked in some manner. So I thought, well, let's have a whack at it. So I've got this divided up into about 3 15-minute blocks, and then open it up for questions and our consideration. Just to give everybody a sense of what documents I've tried to share is that student achievement report that I produce in a report form. There's a slide deck that I do that has some trend analysis and some cohort analysis on it. Then I also supplied some additional documents in the form of like a summary of assessments that we administer in the school district, a kind of a short explanation of what each of those assessments are and the kind of the function they perform, and so on and so forth. And then I believe it was Deirdre Burns that requested that I produce a kind of an overview of the last, I think it was 4 or 5 years of the 3-through 8 testing formats, because there was some general questions coming from the parent community, from teachers, and so on about the length of these tests and how difficult they were and all those issues. So in order to help make some perspective on that, I did I think it was a 4-year retrospective of the length of the tests for math and ELA, and then supplied those documents to you. Just for everybody here, I don't intend on going through every one of those documents line by line, or we will be here till 10 o'clock tonight, and this will turn into a strange form of a graduate seminar, and I don't think anybody's interested in doing that. So I'll try my best to try to fly with the caveat that I just want to reinforce with Paul. If I move by something that doesn't make any sense to anyone, just throw a red flag, say, hey, you throw something at me or whatever. I'm totally flexible on this. Even though I'm dressed in a suit, I'm totally okay. Okay, so let me power up here. And I always like to start these discussions about student achievement, about school climate, about the evaluation of the quality of our school programs in the context of a mission, vision, core values kind of way. And the reason I think I do this every time is not necessarily to be preachy, but to remind this educational community, if nothing else, that I think we believe that we're trying to have our own sense of mission, vision, and core values that drive that, as opposed to being driven by political realities or the state education department or what the latest educational fad that's come up the top chart. That there's a sense here that there's an educational community here, and that we believe things ourselves, and those things drive our thinking here locally. And therefore, as we respond to these things, that kind of stuff is in our minds. So this notion of thinking about every student's generosity of spirit, passion for learning, and success is something that sort of drives us, and this notion of excellent learning environments and dedication and so forth are really centered around this notion of every student. You know, some people say, well, a good mission statement is all kids, all day, all the time. Well, that's sort of what that's saying to me. It's saying that's what this thing is about. So a sense of vision in terms of responding to the changing needs of our community. You might want to even throw in there that additional thing now, responding to the contextual variables that are coming from the federal and state levels that are impinging all of us, whether that be economic, whether that be education policy, and so on. So there's an awful lot that's impinging on public education, but I don't think there's much to argue about that last line there where we think about kids as they leave our schools. And people talk about college and career readiness. Well, things like independent self-directed learners, complex thinkers, collaborative workers, quality producers, ethical decision makers, community contributors, those things hold up over time as people. So, and it speaks to me about something that I'm going to keep saying as I talk through some of this stuff tonight, which is it matters just as much what kind of people we graduate from our schools as what those people know. And so there are two things we have to hang on to simultaneously while we're thinking about student achievement. Even though in a few minutes I'm going to be using a lot of numbers and talking about numbers, we're talking about kids. And I think it's important to remember that. I try to emphasize at least one of the values each time, and I see no better time than now to emphasize this notion of a whole child focus to public education, because I do think that their emotional, social, physical, and academic needs must be met in a holistic way, thinking about them as whole persons and not just as heads that have to be tested and evaluated. And unfortunately, we're in a political environment and an educational policy environment in which much of the pressure is pushed in that direction. And I think we need to decide locally what that means for us here. So I always like to, and again, this is a primer on educational assessment and evaluation, but it's worth stopping and thinking for just a second about that educational assessment is a special kind of evidentiary argument, and I like to think about it this way, because people do too much with testing, and sometimes they do the wrong things with testing, or they do too little, and so there's too much of this stuff. So I try to argue for what I call the Goldilocks approach, and how you go about that is think about how you make valid and reliable inferences about what a student may know, have accomplished, or they're apt to do in the future from those tests. So by definition, educational evaluation and assessment is collecting evidence that supports claims about what students know, or they've accomplished, or they are apt to do in the future. And I think that sets the context for it, because now you're by definition saying that I'm inferring. So you have to watch whether you're making sort of what might be called high versus low inference kinds of statements. Some statements that people make about testing are low inference. In other words, it's pretty obvious that there's a conclusion to draw here. But there's a lot of what I call high inference talk out there now about testing. And I'm concerned about that. So we have to be modulated and thoughtful as we talk about testing. So what do we use it for? Well, we use it to determine the success of individuals, programs, instruction, identified groups. We use it for accountability in the education system, particularly at the summative level, which is at the high school level. There's an interesting wrinkle that has been interjected into our work in the last go-around of public policy, and that is this issue that now districts are mandated, and I want to use that word mandated. I was almost tempted to circle it and point a bunch of arrows at that. We are required now to use assessment data to evaluate our professional faculty and principals. I would just suggest to you that that is a radical departure from the history of public education. And I think anybody who forgets that often will make a lot of mistakes about thinking about what we're doing, because these assessments that we're using were not designed for the purposes of evaluating our professional faculty or our principals. That's not what they were designed for. They're trying to create statistical methods and the quality of metrics to be able to tease out the causal relationship between what teachers do and what principals do and what kids learn. That's a very complicated thing to try to do. And these tests are not ready to do that yet, so I don't think you'd be surprised to see that there's a lot of political controversy out there every time these tests wave over the system, because they're not ready for that yet. They're designing these things to do this under a mandate, and the tests weren't ready when they set the mandate. So they're, as they say up in Albany, if you go to these presentations by the Albany folks, they'll tell you they're building this airplane while they're flying. People like me remind them that there are a bunch of students on this plane while you're flying it that's not ready to fly, but they don't seem to be interested in discussing that. But I want to kind of linger on that, because I'll keep looping back to that issue. In addition to that, they guide intervention and policy decision making. If thoughtfully reflected upon, assessments can be valuable tools to evaluate the quality of your professional program, the quality of the instruction going on, and the quality of the curriculum. But that has to be done in a thoughtful way, not in a politically strident way, devoid of some very careful questions that get asked. So I'll move on to the next one, which is district and school level information about achievements, improvement with respect to specific goals and needs. That's formative assessment. That's really the assessment for learning. And I would suggest to you that this assessment of learning at the summative level has sort of taken precedence, it's pushed itself forward so that people forget that one of the core reasons why we use assessment in schools is to assess the students as they're learning so that we can increase the quality of instruction. That's the purpose of good formative assessment. And we're the best, what I said before about low inference kinds of test environments, that's where you get those kind of test environments, formative assessment. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a while. Individual student information about achievement with respect to various goals set by the district. So, we are interested in the unit of analysis right down to the individual student, the classroom, the grade level, the school, and obviously then the district. So we are interested in all of those things when we talk about educational assessment. Now we're going to sort of start through a roller coaster of numbers, which I'll try to distill quite simply. Most people are aware that back in the early 2000s, during the Bush administration, the No Child Left Behind Act was passed, circa 2001-2002, which was a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Under that act, it was mandated that we all in public education, or at least any of those who took federal funding, or are tied to state ed formulas in any way, shape, or form, have to administer 3 through 8 math and ELA, science tests once in the elementary school, and once in the middle school, and have some kind of summative evaluation in math, ELA, and science at the high school, and then measure your graduation rate. And then we had to be accountable. So that's where the sort of infusion of a lot of accountable talk started to come in using test-based accountability. So all of the numbers that you see across there are really reflections of how our students were performing against these NCLB-aligned tests. Well, this last year here, which was 11-12, you see that the numbers here are significantly lower and start to track down from previous years. All you need to do is look at the, 607 line where everything's tracking up, and then look at that 11-12 line, and you can see that the numbers are down. That is not necessarily a reflect of what the students learned that year and how well they did in school. That is a pure statistical change in most cases, or an alteration in the test formats without sufficient time to shift the curriculum over. And so you have to kind of understand those numbers relative to how everyone else is doing. So what's interesting to me, and I don't want to linger on this too much, and I'll just say this once and then kind of move on, is that if you do a comparison of how this district stood, let's say back in 06-07 against other school districts, and then took that same comparison, even though the numbers are lower, in 11-12, our standing didn't change vis-a-vis those other schools just because our numbers were lower. They all went down together. Because why? Well, it was a very simple reason. They changed the cut point for proficiency. So if I say to you that the pass number is 65, and then I say, now I'm going to change that to 70, well then previously any student who would have got between 65 and 70 no longer passes that test, and therefore that number gets lower. And that's why that number is lower. It's as simple as that. I always throw this slide into the picture because I want to make note that there is a persistent and rather durable observation that can be made, and that is that irrespective of the level of difficulty of the test, and these statistics here hold from the time I started doing this back against the early NCLB test, which is that if you look at our all-student number, our gen ed numbers, and you take out the special education students, you'll notice that it is the rare case that we have special education students meeting on grade level standards, and therefore they score below proficient on a regular basis. That's just a standard thing. One of the reasons why they are able to access special education is because they are behind their age mates and typically require that extra kind of assistance. So they're already behind, so it's not surprising to any of us that when they take on grade level tests that they're going to score below proficient on these tests. It's just the way it is. If you score them against what we call norm reference tests and see how they do against their normal age mates on a comparative test, you'll notice that they score significantly below, on average, a normative sample of students who are similar in their age and grade. So when they take a criterion reference test, like an English language arts test in grades 3 through 8, which is built against grade level standards, it's not surprising to any of us that these students score below proficient. What's interesting about this is that the state education department holds school districts accountable for these students as what they call a disaggregated accountability group. That is, they don't just look at your all-student population, they look separately from your general education group at your special education students and say, oh, those students are not keeping up with their age mates, and therefore you are scoring below what the state education department calls AYP or your AMOs, which is your annual yearly progress or your annual measurable objectives. And that just means a target that you're supposed to meet with all these different groups. Yeah, go ahead.
Are those targets comparative with other special education students in other districts in the state, or is that some sort of an arbitrary target?
They set an annual, tell you what, when I get to this next chart, I'll come back to that because I'll show you an AMO chart in just a second. I'll show you. The short version of that is the state sets a standard annual measurable objective for the school and for the district, and then looks at the special education group as a separate population and then says, did those students meet that target separately? So if they didn't meet it, then the district is quote unquote held accountable. And the way the current system is set up, which it is changing, and so next time you see me talk about this next year, I'll be telling you a whole different way of going about doing this because they're changing it. But the way this is done, these kids were compared to the general education population. They didn't make annual measurable objective. They didn't make AYP. Therefore, you get what's called a red X on your school report card. So you get red X, and we did get red X last year for these special education students. Us and several hundred other school districts in the state of New York, because if this policy persists over time, pretty soon all 697 school districts in the state of New York are going to be red X on there for their special education students, just the way it's set up. It's one of those policy problems they have that they need to do something about. And so if you look at this chart here, this is another way of talking about the same thing. If you look at the LA chart this way, this breaks out all of your disaggregated accountability groups and says, here are your special education students. You'll see that it's 0, 25, 0, 0, 8%, and 18% versus those others across the top. So it is a rather predictable thing. You'll also begin to notice that students who fall into this economically disadvantaged category typically fall below that same standard. And it's something I've been watching a little more through our Title I programs over the last couple of years. So, Lisa, this is what I was talking about with regard to the 3 through 5 annual measurable objectives. So you'll see that the standard in the state of New York was 145. The overall population was 167 out of a standard of 200, but the special education population separated out scored below 145. I believe they were at 139, so they were 6 points below. So that's how we ended up getting red X'd, quote unquote, on the school report card, which is something I always run through when the report cards come out, see if I got red X'd. Figure out what to do about that. Mathematics falls into a similar kind of thing. I'll just show you the same kind of chart here with mathematics. You'll see that the numbers did drop, but they maintained. Again, comparatively, we were actually in a very strong position, particularly in the middle school math area. You'll see the general education only students, so you start to look at those numbers. The gen ed kids performed very respectfully. But if you look at the special education students, they're struggling with on-grade level mathematical expectations. And there's a good reason for that, because if you notice the style of testing that they're using in the math area, it's becoming very demanding, both mathematically and linguistically. So what we're seeing is students who have problems with reading, for example, and a problem with written expression are actually losing points on a lot of items on mathematics tests because they lack the linguistic facility, or they don't have a good handle on understanding the meaning of what's being asked of them, and so they perform the wrong mathematical calculation or something like that. So, yeah.
Is it the same teacher in 6th grade who teaches gen ed math as special ed math?
Generally speaking, for the most part, I'd say there have been exceptions to this. Most of these kids are included right in the general population. Now, they wouldn't be generally in an accelerated math class, they'd be in a regular math class. But they would probably be in a regular math class with some kind of special education support, with perhaps, if they were eligible, in most cases these kids would be, with perhaps some kind of AIS service, so they'd not be seeing an AIS teacher for extra help. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. No, I find it interesting because we see year after year, 5th grade to 6th grade, the same cohort of kids make a dramatic leap in their math scores. And so I attribute that to the teacher. So it's interesting that the special ed students in the same environment aren't making that leap.
Yeah. There's something interesting to me about how it seems like that the kids actually consistently, and if you look across our data over time, this is true right up through high school graduation, the kids seem to consolidate, assimilate the skills that they've been taught and continue to do better and better. And I'm not sure I quite understand that. If you look at the high school graduation rate or the rates at which these kids accumulate high school credits or their Regents scores and so on, you can see that generally speaking, with the supports we have in place, these kids make it eventually. So it's an interesting observation. I would also, and again, I wouldn't know how much to make of this because I'm talking about high inference. I'm going to infer here. But when you get into middle school, you tend to then now get mathematics instructors who are math teachers, as opposed to an elementary school teacher who's Common Branch certified. They tend to be a generalist, so they've been taught how to teach many subjects in a developmentally appropriate way. And that has become a real issue for us in the industry because now we're asking these elementary school teachers who were never trained to teach mathematics in a way that, like, let's say, a secondary math teacher might be in that same way, but they don't have that kind of background, and we're finding that to be challenging, actually. So I wonder if that's it, but again, I'm inferring because I don't really know the answer to that question. Historically, we've hoped that mathematics programs in elementary schools kind of take over that problem, and that a lot of the pedagogical thinking has been done for the teacher in a scripted way, but I'm concerned that now we're going to have to really rethink that. We've actually had some internal conversation about that. Interesting. Okay, so let me just, so you can see we had the same situation here. Our 3.5 was above the 159 line, but again, the special education students fell below that. But we maintained in the elementary school above the line, which essentially means that the elementary school remains in what they call good standing with regard to the accountability. So you can see with this NCLB sort of 2013 line, which oddly enough, even though we have all this race to the top reform going on in the schools now, they haven't changed this 100% rule yet. So I don't know whether they're going to change it, whether they're not going to change it, we don't know. So we're working under multiple kind of rules right now, mainly because the No Child Left Behind Act has not been reauthorized by the federal government. They've been arguing about that down in Washington since 2007. And there are bills on the floor of the Senate and in the House, I hear, and they're still arguing about it. So whether this thing holds for next year or not, but you can see when they did the cut point drops, we ended up pretty far back from where we were headed. So we were actually tracking toward cohort by cohort, getting closer to the goal until they changed the cut point, and now we're back to trying to figure out how to get to that.
Marvin?
Go ahead.
Just practically speaking, what do you anticipate would happen if current legislation stays in place in 13-14 when our district and pretty much none of the other districts in New York State are at 100% on any of these scores? What's the real manifestation of that? What happens? What will the board members reviewing the 13-14 data see?
Well, I'm not sure I could answer that question other than I would say what's going to happen is we'll be calculating against these assessments different metrics that aren't even the same as the metrics that they're using for the NCLB tests. So they're forced by their own policy shift because they exercised the waiver under the Obama administration in the state of New York. So they can't use the numbers that they're generating now against that because they're using whole new statistics. So how they intend to make that work, I really wouldn't know. Talk about high inference, I don't know what I would do.
Okay.
I would encourage them to get in a room as soon as possible and think about that, because I don't know what that means.
Okay.
A bunch of red X's on your report card, possibly. We've all been wondering that, what happens, because it was a policy that was doomed to failure from the day they passed it. So now we're here,
Now we're here.
and now it's not going to pass.
But my point is, it's not like they're going to cut off state aid or reduce state aid for all 700 districts in the state. Okay. Rhetorical question. Okay.
No, but a fair question, one I've been asking myself for 10 years. So,
What they may wind up doing, if not cutting aid, for example, is having all 700 school districts jump through a bunch of hoops, putting together plans, and trying to figure out strategies to do what still is probably impossible. If only to be able to say,
We tried.
got on those school districts and we're making them do some heavy-duty planning to address this issue, and then another 5 years we'll be having a similar
Okay.
conversation.
I was wondering if you have ever looked at, when we're talking about the jump in between 5th grade and 6th grade with the math scores, some years at Chancellor, they have, kids have switched classes for math and kind of been grouped by ability, if that made any difference based on years when they didn't do that, like if that affected their scores anyway. I don't know if you've ever looked at it.
yeah, the problem with that particular strategy was it was never employed long enough to get a sense of whether it was effective or not effective. So it was hard to tell. So I'm not sure I would know the answer to that question, whether one would be better than another. Some of that might be dependent on who it was that was the primary math teacher and how the grouping was done and all that sort of thing. So I haven't looked at it closely, partially because programmatically that's never coalesced into something that they stuck with long enough to even think about it. They tend to go back to where they are now pretty consistently. And part of the dynamic for that too has been to try to figure out the grouping with regard to the numbers of kids who are eligible for special education, for example, and how to manage the service delivery system to make sure that they get services. And so some of that's driven by scheduling, and they end up jammed up on the scheduling. So it's an interesting question. Good question.
So I want to make sure I follow what your question was. Was it that the original plan of all this testing was by 2013-14, the goal was for school districts to have 100% proficiency?
Correct.
So I thought because that was clearly not going to happen, that's what stimulated the new Common Core Learning Standards. Because they realized that just testing isn't going to make people proficient, the curriculum needed to change and become stronger, and that was hopefully going to make people proficient.
Well,
Isn't that what happened? I mean, you say what's going to happen. I think that is what.
my question was, assume for the moment that no district, our district, and few other districts will ever reach 100% in everything. I mean, there are students who will struggle to learn, and that's public education says we're going to work to educate those students. But there will exist one student who will not be proficient according to these standards. What does the state do to districts like us who are at 99, not 100? That was my question. Do they cut off aid? Do they make us jump through extra hoops, put plans in place? Do they push the target out and say, try again next year? Do they say, you have to invest more resources for small group instruction?
Are there consequences?
What are the consequences? And my sense is, we don't know, and B, even if there are consequences, it's going to be fuzzy. I just wondered if anybody, Marvin or Joe, you had a sense of, is there a hard consequence for not getting to 100? Answer no. That's my takeaway.
And the only thing I could add to what Joe said is that, and elaborate a bit on what I said, which is I think they're going to play around with the metrics, they're going to shift the tests, they're going to come up with a new way of measuring student achievement against what you were saying, which is the Common Core standards and the Common Core assessments aligned to a new set of outcomes. And then they're going to start holding school districts accountable to this new set of standards, which will be pushed out into some future year. That would be my prediction as to how this is going to ultimately show up. And the accountability pieces of that, I think I mentioned before, now it's personal. Every individual teacher will be held accountable for the performance of the students on his or her roster in a particular course. So, and the principal will be held accountable for the whole school, and that's mapped to their APPR. So I think they're shifting the way they're going to do the statistics, changing the curriculum, shifting the testing, and shifting the accountability formulas, which is why I kind of said before, I think this is kind of the last time you're going to see these kinds of NCLB data points reported in this manner. I think next year's school report card is going to look different. And we'll see how that goes. So let me just jump to the end game here, which is sort of the one that I like to look at, which is this gap chart, which is, we're still off by, because of the reset, significant 27% all the way 34% in the 8th grade ELA, which has been kind of a standard kind of statistic, where the kids have kind of performed below where we'd like them to, but then they start to catch up as they get into the high school, which is where I will jump to now. And just in the interest of time, I'll just show you, here's a sort of a retrospective back to 03, where we were around, we sort of pitched around this figure between 97%, 86, 97, 94, 91, 98, 97, 95, 95, all the way across. That's been relatively stable as a statistic, but that's a pass rate at 65. So historically, even though our kids have come into the high school kind of all over the place, if you will, the support systems that we've put in place and the accommodations that are allowed in high schools has made it so that our students can be successful and satisfy graduation requirements.
And that's all students, not just general ed?
That's all students who are accessing that, yeah. And again, there's no such thing as students now in public high schools who don't access the general education curriculum. We're allowed to segregate them out anymore. So your secondary ELA scores, now this is something I wanted to highlight here because it is relevant to this discussion this evening, which is you'll see here, this gets back to one of your questions, Paul, and maybe your point, Diane, too, which is if you look here, last year's annual measurable objective for secondary ELA was 188. We were at 195. That's 5 points from the top, okay? In advance of 13-14. So I've been always trying to say to this group every year, if you look at the summative data, we're right at the edge of getting at where we were supposed to be, actually. I mean, I think Joe may have even alluded to this, we were actually one of the fortunate districts at the summative level who are going to be really close to that. Well, so here's what they've done with that statistical change. And this gets back to what Diane was saying about the Common Core Learning Standards and the new assessments. There was a recent statistical adjustment done that said that actual college and career readiness is a student getting a 75 or better on the English readings. So what they did was they basically said the new accountability number is 65, is not 65 or better, it's 75 or better. And so everybody's indexes are going to drop. And you'll notice that the state's now lowered their annual measurable objective from 188 to 149. Ours went down, but it's still 20 points higher. So now we're going to turn around and start to go back up again. So again, they made another statistical correction in the accountability formulas to say now you're going to be accountable for not students getting 65 or better on the English regions. We want you to get 75 or better on the English regions. So they're playing with these statistics to a certain degree. So integrated algebra ends up being a similar kind of story. You'll see here, again, these pass rates have been very solid since they instituted this algebra exam, 100%, 97%, 95, 96, 93. So it's been a success story by all counts at the summative level of math. Geometry has also been a similar story. There's a little bit of I think a hidden sort of strength in these numbers too, where historically schools have had a lot of sorting, classifying, tracking, and classes and things of that nature. And we've tried to, by philosophy, move away from that into this notion that we want kids in more demanding classes. So high expectations with high support. Interestingly enough, if you look at those numbers, they've done fine with the support pieces that we're able to put in place in the high school. So we feel pretty confident that we headed off in a good direction on that one. So if you look at secondary math, you'll see the same phenomenon. You'll see they now said the new statistic for math is 80 or better. So it's not 65 or better, it's 80 or better. So you see they dropped the annual measurable objective from 180 to 126, but we still maintain at 172. So again, vis-a-vis the state standard, we sort of held our same position. If you look at it, they changed it. So now what'll happen? Well, predictably, I think in this district, we'll probably figure this out somehow, and we'll start to bend that. But we'll see. That's going to require a real systemic shift, I think, because to say that you're going to have all students college ready for mathematics is a pretty high standard to hold a school district to, particularly with the kind of test-based accountability systems that they're using to say that that is so. So we'll see how that goes. And we'll talk a little more about that when I get a little further. So you can see that, I mean, I started making this chart just for yayas, I don't know, just for my own entertainment, to say, well, if you see you've got 86% of your kids meeting the ELA standard, you've got 73% meeting the math standard at that 75-80 standard. So still very respectful, I think, and I think it's respectable, but you know, it's going to be a challenge to try to get back up above 95 to 100%.
Are there benchmarks compared to other districts in the state on this metric?
You know, I haven't seen any comparative data. Well, I should say that. I mean, if I wanted to go into everybody's report card, I could go find those numbers. No,
but
I'm not seeing any.
It doesn't get called out. Because to me, as a layperson, that's, I think, a good high-level metric of, at the end of the K through 12 pipe, are they college or career ready, or put whatever tag you want on it. And this is one metric. It's a simple metric. It combines English and math. And
that's it. I'll kind of elaborate a little bit more on this college and career readiness idea in a little bit. Back to Joe's point about my informed opinions. I have a lot of them. I'm not sure.
And I'll point out to my colleagues who haven't heard this short speech before, the really disturbing thing about this is that, you know, there's 20 to 25% of the students that leave Rhinebeck who are not proficient in either English or math. What is their future? It's not bright. And that's, you know, you do the math. 100 kids a year, 20 to 25, walk out the door, cap and gown, not proficient in math, not proficient in English. They're going to struggle to make change. That's what that chart says to me. Yeah?
Well, I'm not sure to quibble with that, but I might think about it a different way. How about that?
Okay.
I'm inclined to agree with you, and what's interesting about this statistic, and I even go a little further, is that when those kids go off to college, which most of them do here, right? I mean, we graduate most of our kids.
Yeah.
Most of those kids all go off to college. So now they're in freshman English, they're in freshman math, and guess what they're eligible for? Usually it's some kind of class that you have to take before you take regular freshman English. And so that it adds on to their college expenses, and statistically, that's demonstrable, what I just said.
And I'm sure you'll see in the data, and you'll correct me if I get the numbers wrong, 50% of the kids that start a community college, which is where you go if you're not proficient in English and math, don't graduate after 6 years.
Yeah.
So now you've spent up to 6 years after high school, and you don't have anything. You don't have any degree. And at the start of that 6-year journey, we knew you weren't proficient in English and math. And I ask again, what's their future?
It's a tough thing. I would just say that I think part of what's happened that is a positive thing that's going to take some time to get our heads around is that now, the way the curriculum is set, it's kind of expect to Diane's point, is to say, okay, so what would an exit high school graduate look like who was college ready, who didn't have that problem? What would that curriculum look like at that level? And then back map that all the way to kindergarten and create learning progressions that say, okay, from kindergarten you'll master these things, first grade, second grade, third grade, all the way up through, so that these kids have a better statistical chance of being successful. And I think this has been a game changer in terms of switching our thinking. I would suggest to you, this is where I'm not going to quibble, but I would just say I think it requires some nuanced thinking. The tests that they're using to make these determinations right now aren't as high quality as I think we'd like. So we could be exaggerating, or we could actually be underestimating the problem,
Right.
is my point. And it's hard to get our heads around that right now, but it's a real issue.
I think what validates those numbers a little bit for me is, last time I looked across the board, across the country, college freshmen, 25% of them require some remedial class. So that would be the same 25% who aren't hitting the benchmark. I had another point I wanted to make regarding that. But so I think that if there's a hope that this new curriculum is going to do something to change that, one has to accept the reality that it's a 12-year curriculum. It's not going to change it in 1 or 2 years, too. So it's a work in progress.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent point. And the new testing, which is coming online, that's some of the gear grinding we're getting, because if you switch a curriculum over, now you've got a bunch of students who, say, 7th and 8th grade, who didn't go through a curriculum like that. Now they're being assessed using assessments that are probably less than perfect because they haven't worked out the details on how to get the assessments right. You're assessing kids who probably didn't get that kind of rigorous curriculum all the way up. So there's a bunch of problems with this. That's one of the remarks I was going to make about these current battery of tests. But I think it is fair to say that this is a real issue. And I think it would be a mistake. That's what I mean by the just right thinking about this. You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, wait a second, this information that we're getting in the form of test-based accountability and data is full of just all noise and no signal. There is a signal here, but you have to listen to what the signal is and not draw unwarranted conclusions. So, enough said on that point, but I think that's an excellent set of observations. Now, again, and I think that this is particularly a temptation of districts like Rhinebeck, where we have a very solid community of support. We have a great bunch of kids that come to school here who, by and large, work very hard when they come to school. And quite frankly, if you look at the history of our test-based accountability at the summative level, I mean, look what it says to you. Clear back in that 08, 09 in ELA, or pick a subject. I mean, it really doesn't matter. We have been at that 100% mark all along, with the possible exception of the real advanced math, where we try to push kids into those harder classes, where as they get into these harder and harder math classes, you're going to be surprised that those kids perhaps aren't going to do as well. But again, you can get lulled into a kind of, may I use the word complacency, to think, well, maybe we could do better when you're already at that point. So there may be a silver lining in this message of college and career readiness as well, for us to really take a look at. Okay, so there's some interesting things to think about. Again, SAT scores over time. If you look at our comparisons, again, again, it's another one of these things you don't like to make a lot out of, but you also, if you just look on average compared to the New York State average and the national average, our kids well perform above in critical reading, math, and writing, and always have. The last couple of years have been particularly higher. I think these are the best 2 years in a row on SATs, which, again, that's kind of it's one of those markers for kids that they know that has something to do with college and career readiness already. So it is something they put time, effort, and energy into because it matters to them, I think. So it is an indication, but again, do you want to say, make that next step and say, well, I'm going to make a low inference observation that that's the school district's cause? I don't think you can say that. I think you can just say it is what it is numerically, and the numbers are strong, and it's something that the kids in this community should be proud of. Another thing that I think we've tried to push on these last several years is, I think we had a total of 196 AP exams, and this is biology, Calc AB, chemistry, ELA composition, European, French, and so on and so forth. Overall, the numbers, 3s, 4s, and 5s, are respectable as compared to what I've seen in other data sets. So I feel like we've pushed kids into taking those more demanding sort of college-ready classes, and they've actually risen to the occasion. So I think there's some good news in that, in that I think there's lots of growth possibility here in the school district. I think the kids have the intellectual horsepower, and the community's there to support it, and so I'm kind of excited about seeing what we can do. And I think our AP exam results over these last many years has demonstrated that. So let's talk about Rhinebeck High School. Obviously, Newsweek top 3,000 high schools. 372 this year. That metric is important because it's a graduation rate, it's a college matriculation, it's AP exams to graduate ratio, it's average SATs, it's AP scores, it's number of AP courses. So it's a nuanced enough metric that it tells you something and how you stand against other high schools in the country. This metric was, identified, quite frankly, to deal with that issue that you were referring to, Paul, which is college and life ready. So there's some things to celebrate here. There's probably some things that we need to step back and say, hey, can we do better? The high school graduation rate last year, I think, was 94%. I think 92% of those kids went off to college. So I like to stop there and say, one thing we have to recognize in our K-12 program is we have low mobility. These kids stay with us. They're going through our school system and they're going to college. So we kind of have an ethical and educational responsibility to prepare them for that and to take a hard look at that because that's where they're going. You've always asked, I think I always did this slide with Paul because he asked me some years back about this notion of what happens with these kids who have other outcomes, which is, dropouts, transfers, IEP diplomas, and so on. Again, this story kind of is pretty straightforward. 6 of those kids were either special education, low SES, ESL eligible. There were a lot of outside the school risk factors, family, and so on and so forth. Most of these kids had a real difficult time as they came up through the ranks in the school system. They found testing challenging. The kids that did transfer into GAD did take and pass it, so we felt like that was a little bit of a silver lining in terms of a diversion because at least it gave them some option that otherwise they would have had none. The still enrolled student, actually interestingly enough, is on a 5-year plan, is going to graduate and satisfy requirements this year, and actually I just heard is headed off to college. So there's some good news in there, and again, no matter what happens in a cohort of 100 kids, 5's a big deal. I mean, it just is. So we have to continue to kind of go back to look at that. But that's the profile of those kids. So what are some positive trends? Well, the science results in the elementary school remain strong. However, I would suggest that I think we need to go back and look at our science program in the elementary school from a science, technology, engineering, mathematics approach and not just look at it from a test-based accountability because I think that while that metric is strong and a positive sign to the community, I think there is much ground to be gained in that area in the elementary school, which actually could help us in some of these other ways too. The elementary and middle school mathematics as a pipeline still looks good, and as they move into high school, still looks good. And I still think that this issue of elementary school mathematics is going to require our attention over time. The middle school ELA continues to improve despite this fact that they keep changing these cut points, and I'll get back to that on a curriculum note in a few minutes. The middle school science is the same thing. It continues to be strong. The math results as a function of pass rates tends to be strong. The English Regents tends to be strong. And all those Regents exams, as I pointed out, tends to be strong. With the caveat of now shifting into a college and career readiness set of standards. Which, by the way, I think also applies to getting that message out into the community and partnering with the community more as that's now the new expectation. Because I think that would be an important issue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that other chart that we were talking about where the college and career ready ELA is at 86% and math at 73%, yeah. So that is testing that finishes in 8th grade?
That's the English Regents grade 11.
Oh, these are the Regents exams?
Or the integrated algebra 1, the first math reading.
Okay, I was just trying to compare it to the chart you just showed us of the Regents results.
Yeah, because the reason the differences between that is that these numbers are derived from the percentages of students who got 75 or better on the ELA and 80 or better on the math, as opposed to just passing at 65. That's why there's two different numbers.
Oh, so this is a pass rate on the positive trends and strengths, and this is the 75 and 80. Okay, I get it.
Right.
Okay.
Which is confusing as all get out. I apologize, but I think that statistic was generated based on the need that I think Paul was referring to, which is, hey, what does it take in terms of a standard for students to give, and as a matter of fact, the numbers were done by David Koretz at Harvard. He basically said, so what would give a student an 80% chance of taking and passing a freshman English class or a freshman math class? And it's 75 or better on an English Regents and 80%. I mean, that's where the statistics came from, as a matter of fact.
Okay, thanks.
And by the way, that's where the cut points come from that were readjusted all the way back to third grade, because that's why they were lowered, raised rather, was because they were mapped to these statistics. So let me just jump to here. So we'll talk a little bit about, I think there are a lot of successes to talk about in our schools. The overall academic program, I think, is strong and effective across all disciplines. I think that the K-12 faculty, staff, administration here are committed and do take the mission, vision, core values seriously. I think the students should be commended for their hard work. I think that success builds success. Nobody gets punished into being successful in life. So I think anytime we can celebrate, recognize, and reward and acknowledge success, I think we should take opportunity to do that. The middle school math continues to sort of be in the top 4 in the county region, even with the shifts. Our SAT scores continue to be pretty strong. I think the writing score was the highest since 2007 this past year. I think this district offers a multiple opportunity kind of an approach. So I've heard it said that we're kind of a whole package in some ways. We have academics, we have arts, we have athletics, we have extracurricular activities that kids can participate in. So there's a broad range of opportunities for kids to excel and to become whole persons, and I think that's worth talking about. I think this 372 on the Newsweek challenge is worth mentioning. And despite all of the craziness with the state education department and pitching around the numbers, we're still in good standing across all 3 of our schools, which puts us, I think, as a district in a kind of a preferred position to respond to these political context variables that are pushing on the school district a little bit. So talking about growth, I try to talk about it in at least these 5 buckets, in terms of, continuous improvement across all disciplines, taking into account these issues that we're talking about with regard to college and career readiness, strengthening teaching by looking at the new teaching standards and the new APPR regulations. It is worth mentioning that the new standards for teaching, and as they're embedded in the Danielson rubric that we've adopted, are worthy professional standards for teaching and should be held up as a reasonable standard for professional practice for a teacher. It was a good choice. I think the test-based accountability often draws our attention away from maybe some opportunity that's built in there. So I'd like to kind of help us get refocused on that. While testing is important, what's more important is doing the things that result in students doing better in school, in classrooms, and stop thinking about what goes on a test. And the standards help us with that. The ISLIC standards with regard to strong and effective leadership, they're research-based, they're strong. We are using them now to hold ourselves as administrators accountable, and they're national standards and they're totally reasonable. These next 3 things kind of go together in my mind. Healthy and safe schools with regard to climate, I think, is important. I think this district has tried to hang on to these 2 things, that positive school climate and environment and student achievement go together. They're 2 things that we have to hold on to. And I think that the more we continue to reinforce this notion of what I like to call high trust, high expectation, high support environments produce those kinds of outcomes. If we forget that, if we forget building trusting relationships, then you don't get where you're after. If you lower your expectations, you don't get what you're after. If you pull back supports, you don't get what you're after. You have to keep all 3 of those in the mix. Response to intervention is just a more sophisticated way of responding to the needs of these kids, which I think are invariably going to come to our attention year in and year out. We're conducting a grand social experiment, in my opinion. We are now saying that we are not only going to have the quality of access in public education, but we're going to try to somehow or another figure out guaranteed outcomes. That's a different way of thinking about our work. Equity of access historically has been the mantra, going back clear to the Rhinebeck Board of Education, and separate but equal has been found to not be true. Well, now we're saying unequal outcomes are not equal. So what are we going to do about that? And that's really the challenge. And there's some possibility with regard to responsive intervention. I think curriculum development now has become the focus of our attention and energy with regard to Common Core and college and career readiness standards. I will say, in the industry, if you go out and talk to the average person in the curriculum business, you talk to an ELA teacher, a trained math teacher, you hear very little quibbling about the Common Core learning standards. Where all the quibbling is coming from is on the assessment side. I'm telling you. I've been to countless workshops. I don't hear anybody saying, as a matter of fact, I hear the opposite. There's a lot of breath of fresh air talk. Finally, it's clear what kids are supposed to know and be able to do at each grade level. Finally, it's mapped to a target that has a learning progression that makes some kind of sense to everybody. They've narrowed it so there's not so many things for kids to know, and they've deepened it so the kids have to know it better. The problem is they keep testing it in ways that don't make any sense to anybody, and maybe using that stuff for reasons they shouldn't yet. But I think that part of it goes without saying. So it's given us lots of opportunity to have some great conversations about the quality of instruction, the quality of curriculum in our classrooms, and so on. The State Education Department is playing around with this growth value-added assessment stuff. And again, that's the statistics that I think they're playing with. And we'll see what the statistics look like when they come out. I haven't seen them yet. So it's like these last tests for 3 through 8. I don't know what they're going to look like because we had to pack them up, put them in a box, and ship them off to Pearson. So we don't find out what happens with them until they send us back the statistics. And we can't keep the tests. So we don't have the tests, we don't have the statistics, we don't have anything. They're all hiding in a room somewhere at Pearson. So we'll see what those numbers look like.
I just wanted to follow up on one thing you said a moment ago about unequal outcomes being viewed as, what was the quote? Inherently unequal. Right, which gives rise to all sorts of thoughts about constitutional guarantees of equal treatment. How do you see that filtering down to the district level? What are we going to be required to do to ensure equal outcomes for students?
I think you've asked the $64,000 question. Well said, which I thought. I heard Arnie Duncan, who's the current Secretary of Education, say that the great civil rights issue of the 21st century is equity of outcomes in public education for these disaggregated accountability groups. It is no longer acceptable for any kid to graduate from high school not ready for college and career. That's the standard. That's a new thing. Mm-hmm. So how are we going to respond to that? Well, we better do a lot of those things that I'm putting up there and respond to it meaningfully. And even that, in my opinion, is a grand experiment because we're trying to do that which has never been done with tools that have not been built. Mm-hmm. So we'll see.
Okay. Fair enough.
Much easier to provide access, and that has not been any easy journey for the United States. Much harder to say now that the access is there, now we're going to have the same outcomes. Mm-hmm. So let me just jump to and stimulate a further conversation about this, and then I'll sort of open it up for discussion about testing in general. I'll try to sort of rock skip through this, but a simple way this might not be a bad segue. In terms of how the State Education Department of New York has responded to that question that Lisa just asked us, is they want highly effective school leaders, they want demanding assessments, college and career-ready students, statewide standards based on curriculum, or standards-based curriculum that's Common Core aligned, they want highly effective teachers in every classroom, and they want fair and rigorous accountability. So that's the formula to try to accomplish what it is that we just discussed as a constitutional right. So if you look at these systems, this is what we're doing. Let's get back here quick. We're aligning to the Common Core, building instructional data systems to monitor student progress as they come up through the system, and we're recruiting, developing, retaining, and rewarding effective teachers and principals. That's what's going on, and that's the reform agenda. They have this on a timeline that's pretty tight. Some of the gear grinding that you're hearing out in the field is based on this timeline right here. because they're taking the 3 through 8 testing system and they're rolling it over to the Common Core. They did the first round of that this year. So was I surprised that there was gear grinding and lots of concern about the testing this year? Not even slightly. I was anticipating it. Why? Because they basically just did a hard stop, hard start in 12-13. They gave us one instructional cycle to shift, and then they started testing. That's how they did it. Simple as that. It was by legislative fiat. They just adopted a law and said, thus and so shall be. And so now we're here. So that's going to go on for 2 years, but at least one more year in 13-14, and then they are going to migrate over to this partnership for the assessment of the readiness for college and career. This is what we're affectionately known as the PARC assessments. And so those are a new round of assessments that are being developed as we speak. This 11th grade Regents exam that was now last year and this year against the 96 and 05 Common Core, or Core rather, will now be assessed against the Common Core. So there will be a hard stop, hard start next year in the English Regents. So they're doing some retooling with regard to the English Regents. They are going to do a phase-in plan, so they're going to offer the old Regents and this new Regents next year. They're going to do the testing for the new Regents in early June, and then they're going to do the regular Regents that they've been giving in late June, and they're going to give districts the option to use both for a time period, and then they're going to migrate over to PARC, at which time there will be no more old Regents exam.
So are you saying that schools have the option to administer both tests to their students? Or choose one or the other?
I believe you can do both of those things. You can choose to do one or the other or both in this first year. And then as time goes on, those choices disappear, if I understood the memo correctly. I am always cautious about saying things like that, and you'll note some hesitancy. I have read so many state education memos in the last 6 months, and Joe's heard me, I wouldn't say it's whine, I'll say opine, about the fact that it depends on which day you read a memo from the Deputy Commissioner's office, what the rule is on things like that. So right now, the rule is what I said, so we'll see if the rule changes. Mr. Salens has made a liar out of me more times than once this year, I would say. He's the Deputy Commissioner. All right, so the same is true with regard to the 3 through 8 math, hard start, hard stop, hard start this year. And then Algebra 1 will then be aligned with the Common Core, and then eventually with the PARC assessments in 14-15. And then geometry comes on the year after that in 14-15, and then in 15-16 you get the PARC assessments. Algebra 2 comes in the year after that. So you can see they've got a phase-in plan for mathematics. They give us a little breathing room to transfer that over, which makes good sense to me. We just jump to the next subjects, which is science and social studies. Got the same thing going on across those disciplines also. They have adopted now these things that are called the next generation science standards, brand new standards in science that have been written in cooperation with the National Science Foundation and so on, with a Common Core infusion. That will start in the 13-14 school year, and we will need to start to align our curricula in science against those standards. We'll have to start looking at earth science, the environment, and so on and so forth. You'll see that chem and physics come on later, but they'll have the same phase-in plan with science. Social studies is aligned, continuing with the old standards in 1996, but they're going to ask us to infuse Common Core standards into that curriculum, and we're working on some of that even as we speak. Same thing will be true with regard to middle school, and the Common Core alignment there at the bottom with the U.S. history and government is they're asking us to do Common Core infusion. So you'll see that circa 14-15-ish, we're fully aligned across the entire K-12 spectrum against these new Common Core standards across all disciplines. They're doing that, and again, I'm not going to go into all this stuff in great detail, but they're issuing what are called, this is called the Tri-State Rubric, which is basically a rubric that identifies all the key components of the Common Core learning standards and instructional shifts, and says, okay, we're going to develop instructional units at the state level, and they use their Race to the Top money to actually develop. They didn't develop them themselves, they bought them. They went into a partnership with Expeditionary Learning, Core Knowledge, and another company's name that I don't recognize that for the high school, that basically wrote an entire curriculum against the Common Core and are making that available free of charge to school districts. So the mantra at the State Education Department is you can adopt, you can adapt, or you can ignore, but you have to align your curriculum to something that looks like that rubric. So thus far, the feedback here locally from the teachers and our own administrative thinking is that we don't want to adopt wholesale what the state is producing, and rather we'd like to see this be an evolutionary shift. So we're using the tri-state rubrics as a screen to evaluate the units of study that the teachers are writing now as they're aligning their curricula with the Common Core. So there's that stuff's going on in earnest as we speak, and will be this summer in a major way. These shifts, again, I won't talk about them in detail, but the shifts are balancing informational and literary text, knowledge in the discipline, staircase of complexity, text-based answers, writing from sources, academic vocabulary. Most of that, for those of us who are educated, that should sound pretty familiar. That's academic work. And if I could say one thing about the Common Core is very academic in the way it's orientated, and it's in a very planful way, increasingly and stubbornly rigorous. That is, the curriculum is going to get more and more rigorous. And so that's what this notion of staircase of complexity really talks about. And particularly with regard to the reading of complex text and using complex texts to marshal intellectually sophisticated academic arguments and be able to speak them in a meaningful way and write them in a meaningful way and read them and be able to analyze that kind of written material. It's the kind of stuff that typically we do when we go to college. So it's not surprising we'd be asking kids to do this at younger and younger ages. Same thing is true in math. It's much more focused. So again, they're trying to get away from this, sort of mile wide, inch thick topical coverage in math. We got to move on now. We're done with whole numbers, and now we're going to move to the fractions, and then after that it's percents and decimals, and now we're off to whatever. Now it's a much more deeper, much more holistic understanding of math, which leads to a much more coherent sort of learning progression across content and concepts. There is a much more intense focus on computational fluency. So you're going to see over time, kids are going to have a very fluent understanding of mathematics, and that's not just learning how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide single-digit numbers in your head. That's having a number sense in your head. That's having a base 10 grid in your head, so that you can understand numerical relationships in your head, so that you can use that in a fluent way to solve problems. Because what the cognitive science says is if your mind is using up a lot of energy to solve low-level, fluency problems in mathematics, you can't work on complex problems. So you need to have a certain kind of mathematical fluency. And it's absolutely true. Anybody who knows anything about math knows that that's true. So a deep understanding is a very important thing, which means not just understanding it. And I remember being taught math this way myself. I was taught by a math teacher who said, just do it this way. Just do this, and you'll get the right answer. So being a good German boy from the Midwest, I just did what I was told and always got A's in math. I had no idea why. I'm telling you right now. I can still do it, I think. It'd take me about a half an hour to figure it out. She told me to do this, just do it. I'd get the right answer, but I couldn't tell you why. Now they want you to be able to know why and be able to use it in a way that demonstrates that you know why. That's a different thing. And they want you to be able to apply that with this kind of sense of dual intensity. That is, rapid fluency with rapid application to solve real-world mathematical problems. You encounter a problem, you create a mathematical model, and you resolve that problem by creating a mathematical model. You should be able to do that at the end of a course of instruction in a Common Core setting fluently. That's the plan. Sounds like a good plan to me, actually. That's why I'm saying if you get in a room, you'll see a lot of head nodding amongst teachers that go, wow, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Going back to an issue that you raised earlier, and this ties in with it for me here, the issue about bringing on the standards that are going to, that these assessments are going to reflect for kids who have not started out in that system. So, a kid who starts out in kindergarten and works through, gets to the end of 8th grade and may be able to accomplish all of these things. A kid who's, it's being applied to today, who's going to be an 8th grader starting in September, isn't going to or isn't necessarily going to be able to have the same ability to produce these results. And what's the solution to that problem? And maybe there's no solution, but...
Well, I can tell you the State Education Department is decidedly unsympathetic to that problem. We've got to figure that out. And we saw that in the testing. We saw kids who would normally do quite well, but because they didn't close read the text, they didn't have a good enough command of the fluency, they couldn't create a mathematical model from a verbal problem, so they couldn't resolve the problem that was at hand. And they couldn't pick out of a selection of 4 choices, for example, which we might say, oh gosh, that's a multiple choice test. But if all 4 answers could be correct, and the only way to resolve that is by processing that using a mathematical model, then now what do you do? Well, if I don't know how to do that, I don't know how to do it. And we saw that. We did. And so it's an issue. And I think our teachers, when you talk about a wake-up call, it was a little scary for people because it's like, oh my goodness, these kids can't do this, and we've got to change what we're doing. So I don't know what the answer is. I think you're going to see a depressed effect on the scores, and I also think you have the added complexity of they don't have the testing quite right yet, because I think they're playing in an arena on the test world that they've never gone before, because they're trying to test skills and knowledge that they've never really tried to test before, so I don't think they've got it quite right yet. And that's what we heard, and we saw that when they scored at regional. For example, some complexity that's built into this. We had tables stored these exams. So one table over here, one table over here. This table would have a problem with a particular item. They said, we get stuck, we don't know what to do. We call it the help desk in Albany. There's a Pearson person up there. The person says the answer is this. They'd score it. Then they'd call another person at state ed at the help desk, and they'd get another person from Pearson. The person would tell them something different. So that started to surface in the course of the scoring. So what ended up happening was we started to find out that, in fact, they don't necessarily have this together yet. So this data that's going to come out of this wave of testing that we just finished is going to be full of a lot of noise, and we'll see how much signal is in it. They got a lot of scrubbing to do in order to make this stuff have meaning because of all the confounds that we're talking about. So we'll see.
Well, but even going beyond the question of what the test scores look like, which is an issue for us, just in terms of what the kids are learning. If you say it's valuable enough to rejigger the curriculum in a major way so that kids who complete 8th grade can meet all of these quality elements, what does that mean for the kids who are in 8th grade now? Who haven't had the benefit of the build-up to that? Have we failed in our mission of educating them if they can't do the things that 8th graders will be able to do later on?
Well, I think that if you talk to teachers about this, they'll tell you that they're having to change what they're doing on the fly. And sometimes trying to work the answers to those questions out, because they're, as I say, this hard stop, hard start problem. We had to teach this other curriculum this other way. Now we're being asked to teach this other way. So there's kind of some inherent unfairnesses in this quest to create this equity of outcome. If you think about it, that we're not quite sure we know what to do about it. I mean, I think you're surfacing a real legitimate issue. And I think teachers are feeling it, which will map to another issue that I'm going to raise in just a second here. Again, I don't need to dwell on this part.
Marvin, just going back to about 4 charts from the one we were just on to the one where you referred to the hard stop and hard start.
Yeah.
It looks to me like kids who are, for example, in math, 12, 13, they're going through the hard stop, hard start with the math this year. Looks like they're going to do the same thing next year, and then the year after that, and the year after that. What does that say for that group of kids they're going to be dealing with changes in the curriculum and testing and all sorts of various and sundry changes over their entire 4 years of high school.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the only answer to that, Mark, and I mean, just being transparent, is the teachers are going to have to change fast. They're going to have to get their curriculum right, and they're going to have to change the way they teach to ensure that these kids can make up the ground. And it remains to be seen whether or not that's possible, honestly. We're having to change things. For example, we just finished, well, we're not quite done yet, but we will be soon, with a round of integrated algebra 1. We're going to test against that, and we're going to switch that curriculum over to Common Core. We're going to teach that curriculum differently to the incoming kids that are going to go into 8th grade out of 7th grade this year. Now, the fortunate thing is that the 7th grade teacher and the 6th grade teacher, and we've had our eye on this Common Core thing for a while, so they've started to shift. So I think there may be a little relief for those kids as like that group of kids that goes into this integrated algebra class next year, either out of 7 or 8, are going to have an advantage, I think, because at least they've had a couple of years of people seeing where it was headed, so they're used to that intensity and they're getting a little more practice at the classroom level. And we've seen some of that shifting. And I've seen this 6th grade and 7th grade math teachers do that. And I know Mary has done that in the 8th too. So I'm hoping that that's going to help, and I think it's going to require a all hands on deck approach. We're hoping, and we'll see how much pressure is pushed on the AIS program for math, but we may see some pressure in there too. Sort of kiddingly said, we're going to have to hire a whole army of AIS teachers if we're not careful around here, but hopefully not. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I just was, I think Mark's highlighting the stress. It's not like, this whole thing, it's not just like, oh, a kid is stressed taking a test, that's like another issue. It's sort of, you're describing that Pearson's doing this on the fly. Well, maybe we don't really know what this test is. Oh, there's an answer, it could be this answer or that answer, or, these other issues that we heard about the length of directions and whatnot. And there could be real consequences for the kids that are not just like that day, but if you go into AIS or then the next year a new test that, may or may not have been the kinks worked out in. So I just think that the consequences for the kids and who are in these, the cohort that's getting all of them new could be real consequences that are, I just think the characterization of it just being like a stressful couple of days maybe doesn't have the depth of it. It's more like maybe you could end up in classroom because the school hasn't been prepared properly, given a proper amount of time to do what needs to be done, and the tests haven't been properly developed and tested themselves.
Totally concur with that. We had a particularly egregious example that sort of broke my heart was that at regional, there was a 7th grade girl, obviously don't know who it is, wrote on her test because she couldn't finish it. She said, I don't know how to do this. Please don't put me in AIS. I want to be in chorus next year. And didn't finish the test. That was what the scorers read for her answer to the question. And I have to say, as educators, when you hear stuff like that, you're right. This is not just like kids in a test setting stressed out for a couple of hours and, oh my goodness, that was really hard. It matters. It matters to everybody. And so I think that gets to that question that we talked about at CDEP the other day, and we talked about in this curriculum subcommittee, which is how is this educational community going to react to this? I'm trying to spell out what I think are the positive aspects of this long term, but what are some very serious challenges that we're facing between now and then. Mm-hmm. And I'd be lying to you if I said I knew the answer to those questions. As you can tell, I don't have a lot when you start pushing them. We're going through it. I mean, that's what we have to do, unless somebody tells us otherwise. So let me just move back up to here. I'll put a cherry on top of this thing with talking about teacher evaluation, which is, I like this because it reminds me of something
that we'd all like right now?
We all like it now. So I threw that slide in toward the end. It's like 2 years more. So anyway, if you think about this annual professional performance review thing, now we're going to rate teachers and principals based on this system that out of 100 points, 60 of which will come off of their performance evaluation. Most of them will get 2 evaluations using the Danielson rubric for, EBO is evidence-based observations, so we're going to use the rubric to evaluate, and you'll get so many points out of 60. Then we're also going to have this, what's called the state 20, and then we're also going to have the local 20. So that's test-based accountability. The state 20 is all those assessments I talked about, every single one of them are loaded into that little item right there. The local assessments are going to be either the NWA MAPS assessment in some cases, or some locally developed assessments of one sort or another that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But this evaluation formula, make no mistake about it, is a test-based accountability system at the personnel level. So, 20 to 25%. Now, why do we say 20 to 25%? Well, because the State Education Department has told us and put us on notice that if they develop what's called a value-added metric based on this most recent set of tests, then they will now count for the state 25% of the teacher's score instead of 20%. So it'll be a fourth of their score instead of 20%. I heard that Commissioner King has it on the as a Regents action item for the month of June to adopt. So I'm functioning on the assumption that it's going to be 25 instead of 20 for next year. I don't think he's going to put it in place for this year. But again, could he? Sure. He's done stuff like that.
So could you just describe a value-added metric, what that means for test score, like what that is?
I noticed you don't have a chart describing it in here.
You do not want to see the algebraic formula. You're talking about some advanced mathematics with some voodoo statistics. What's a simple way to understand that? Okay, there are two ways to understand student growth, which is basically a from-to statement. From this point A, I grow to this point B. Right? So I start out at the beginning of the year. I use some kind of metric that says, use a pretest that says I know this amount against this set of learning. Then I go through a sequence of instruction, and then I give you a test at the end, and I can say that you grew from point A to point B, or didn't, depending upon. Now, I can't make any causal statements about what caused that to either happen or not happen. I can only say it did. It could be a function of all kinds of things. It could be that your parents are both geniuses and they sit and read to you all the time, and one of them is an English professor and the other one's a math professor, and you just got lucky. I mean, you literally don't know what caused that difference. You don't know what the variables are that load onto the construct of that growth. That's a fairly simple thing to understand. Value-added metric says we're going to go one step further, and we're going to tease out what average growth is for a student that had a similar starting point, right? Given the same set of variables that I started with, that is my special education classification, my standard scores, my disaggregated accountability group status, and so on and so forth. And then how did the average performance of that student perform, and then how did I as a student perform against those like students on average. And then when I do that, I will then tease out what value, quote unquote, was added by the teacher statistically, and therefore I make a causal statement. In other words, I say what accounts for this movement from here to here as compared on average to a student just like me was the teacher. And the teacher was responsible for 25% of the variance, let's just say. And notice the number, 25%. So there's a reason why that 25% is in the statute, was because on average, the value-added statistics that are done at the Value-Added Resource Center at the University of Madison, they're all over the place. There's one in Tennessee. They all kind of go up the same thing. There's a wide variance to tease out the causality. It varies from 5% of the variance, the teacher, to 50% of the variance. But on average, the variance is about 25%. So they're playing in an arena of statistics that they don't have quite worked out yet either. But they've decided that it's about 25% of the variance, and that's what they're going with. So that's the distinction between a growth and a value added. There's a little bit more nuance to that, but it's not important. If you saw a mathematical model of it, you'd probably see the nuance. So, I'm not sure how helpful that was.
Well, the last I looked into this, there are a lot of criticisms from people that they're actually, this is not data, there's no like algorithm that any researcher can say, yeah, this actually can give us good information.
Well, here's another additional complexity to that. This data is highly unstable year on year, cohort to cohort. It's subject to cohort effects. So if I'm a teacher, so teacher Krebs is a teacher, and let's just say 1 year I come in as a highly effective teacher and I get all 25 of my points on a value-added metric. Different cohort of kids comes through, the next year I only get 19 of my points. Another year I might only get 10 of my points. And some of the variables that load on to that construct don't have anything to do with me. And the statistics are not subtle enough. That's what I mean by they're playing in this arena where the statistics aren't subtle enough to tease out the causality. Because remember, when you move from correlations to causality in any kind of discussion, you're in a totally different arena. The demands on the statistics are much higher. And they, quite frankly, again, are using assessments against a curriculum that was a hard stop, hard start, with metrics that are not fully worked out yet, which have a questionable history in the research. So I'm being honest about that. It is true. And that's why I'm critical of the rate and pace at which they have tried to go here with this test-based accountability. So you'll notice a tone change here in my own, as Joe referred to, my informed opinion here. I really do believe they've run out ahead of the field here with this. Not that they're not on to something, because think about this from a medical point of view. Good metrics makes good diagnosis, which makes good treatment. Good metrics, knowing your learners, having good curriculum, good instruction makes better outcomes. So that makes a lot of sense to me. But if you have bad metrics, then you can't really do that. And then if you run out ahead of the field and you say to a teacher, now I'm going to hold you personally responsible, that's really hard to sell in an environment that is highly politicized and unionized. It unfocuses the conversation. Now, all the stuff that we were talking about before, we're not talking about that anymore. We're talking about all this other stuff. So they've been decidedly unhelpful in running out ahead of the field with this. So I digressed and editorialized a bit.
No, I think that
I'm right.
all that's important, and honestly, even in the medical field, there are many issues that are highly contested. If you're trying to decide whether you should get your mammogram at 40 or over or 50, I'm sure all the women in this room could say, gee, there's a whole lot of research that says a lot of different things 15 years ago than today. So I appreciate your comments that they've gone ahead of what we know to be kind of information that's meaningful and real, based in a statistical reality as opposed to some sort of, as you said, voodoo statistic.
Yeah. So we'll see. I am sitting on my hands waiting for these statistics to come back over the summer. I can't wait. We have yet to see the mathematical models, so those aren't subject to the intellectual scrutiny that you would normally expect scientific research to be subjected to, peer review, so on and so forth. So it's fair enough. You want to play high standard games with mathematical models, then I think there ought to be people who peer review this stuff normally with some routine, subject that to some critical review, and see if it holds up under the white hot heat of pressure. I mean, I think that's only fair. And they're not there yet. So I think all of us are kind of going, okay, you started this. So now, produce. I would not want to be you right now.
Mara, I just want to... No, it's okay. Thank you. I mean, I think there was really a comprehensive overview that included everything, including a lot of good stuff and some difficulties getting through it. You mentioned a couple of times math at the elementary school level and having to rethink it in the future the approach and the content knowledge of what's required to implement this curriculum. As at a board level, we're going to have, long-term planning is our job, and we're looking at a shrinking size of an elementary school. So I'm wondering if you could just elaborate in your head what you think the possibilities are to address that problem.
Well, I can talk about what I read in the educational research and literature that I'm seeing that makes a lot of sense to me. It really falls into two different buckets. One is, I think we've got a professional development challenge on our hands in elementary schools that we historically put in the bucket of literacy, because we thought that teachers need to teach kids how to read at the early grades so that they can then read to learn as they get into the intermediate levels, so that they can be ready for the secondary. And so we put a lot of energy into teaching teachers how to teach kids how to read and how to teach kids how to write. And that has gone relatively well, actually. We did not do the same thing with math. So now we're asking them to teach like mathematicians, and a lot of them don't know the math. And again, I want to say that in a way that I don't mean that as a criticism. I'm simply just pointing out that some people actually shy away from mathematics, probably because they were educated in math like I was. The kids, some people got it and then they moved on through. But if you didn't get it, you were just done. Well, I think that happened to a lot of people, and so they don't understand the math. So when they get to negative numbers or add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions, they don't understand why you multiply one fraction times another, you might get a whole number. They don't have any idea what that means. And why does that happen? And because they don't understand, so they teach kids simple algorithms, but they don't teach mathematical understanding. So there's a professional development challenge there, I think, for people. And it's not just how to teach it, it's understanding it yourself. So I think that's one set of problems. I think another set of problems is support systems that are built in place to help kids who are going to be behind their age mates. If you look at the mathematics AIS support system in the elementary schools, they're nothing like the ELS supports. They're relatively weak, and they're sort of superficial and responding as best you can, because ultimately I think there's been an assumption that if you just stick with the curriculum and let the kids move on through, it'll work itself out over time. And that is not true if you look at those instructional shifts. It doesn't happen. And if you look at the summative data, it's done. It doesn't happen. So that assumption's false. So now we've got to talk about, okay, so what are we going to do to make those adjustments on the first teaching side, which deals with my first issue, and support side when kids slip through the safety net on the support side. So I think it's a both-and kind of problem. And could be some status quo change. The existing, I like to say the existing system was perfectly designed to solve yesterday's problems. So we've got to come up with a new system to solve today's problems, and that may mean we have to change some things.
Thanks.
Is that helpful? So let me get to, just quickly on the local side, see all this stuff in APSCO is assessment talk, that's why I'm just bringing it up just generally. If you look at the locally selected measurement, they required school districts to either develop your own local assessments and administer them, or buy a third-party assessment and administer it and use it for the local assessment. As simple as that. So this district, in an effort through the process of collective bargaining and negotiation, was in a position where we had to negotiate to get something done in time to satisfy a requirement which was due by, whatever it was, January the 10th or something. 17th, that's tax due. Jerry spent a lot of quality time during that time, as I recall, sequestered away in his office trying to figure out how to fill out that stuff. But the point is we had to have that done by a certain time, so we adopted this NWA match program, so we're now assessing kids using this new assessment battery on the local side. In addition to that, there are a bunch of new assessments that had to get written that were on the state side where there was no state test that had to be written that are also going to be used for the local 20 or what may become the local 15. So there was a lot of pressure to create a lot of new assessments all at once. So you're talking about a sort of a hard stop, hard start. Now there was no real stop. It was just, now you're going to do this too. So there was some hard start, hard stopping in the curriculum side, and then there was and you're going to start doing all this testing. And you have to do it now. And if you don't, and if you're out of compliance, we're going to start doing bad things to you, whatever we didn't think of, maybe not give you your aid or whatever it was. So we had to put that in place. So that was put in place mid-year, essentially past mid-year by the time we got the first battery assessments done. So we were required to do something that is humanly impossible because it takes a full instructional cycle to do what we've signed on to. So we can't do what it is in full faith to the plan because the plan was designed to be done over the course of a whole school year. So again, there are these sort of unintended irrational policy implications sometimes when public policy people start to play at 30,000-foot constitutional guarantee levels. They forget there's a lot of other stuff going down here where the ants are running around on the ant, I guess. So we created SLOs. And I'll just run by, let's see, let me go back to the SLOs. What a SLO is essentially is articulating at the beginning of a school year what a set of students will know and be able to do at the end of instruction. Then you measure what those students know against whatever it is you want them to know and be able to do at the end. That's called baseline data. Then you project how well you think each one of those individual students is going to do against that. Those are called learning targets. And then you teach your curriculum. And then you see, how do they all do? So it's sort of like conducting a simple sort of, A-B sort of science experiment. This is where we start, this is what I'm going to do in between, and I'm going to measure what the effect was on the back end. That's really what a SLO is. And so SLOs were written by any teacher that did not have a growth percentile or some kind of standard score from a grade 4 through 8 math and ELA test. So think about that. That's almost everybody, other than if you teach math and ELA grades 4 through 8. I think we calculated it's about 80% of the staff. So now, all of a sudden, now we've got to manage all that, because that's part of the policy, to manage the state 20. Wherever there is a state test, you have to use that as the end test for the SLO. So the English Regents is a good example. English Regents you give at the end of the 11th grade year. So if you teach English Regents to your students, then you have to use the English Regents as the assessment at the end of your semester. So you have to predict at the beginning, based on baseline data, how you think the students are going to do against the English Regents. And then the percentages of those kids are put in what I call a heady transposition, which just means what some percentage of kids equals highly effective, some percentage equals effective, some percentage equals developing, and some percentage equals ineffective. And we had to do that on the fly with, like I said, about 80%
Marvin?
Okay.
So can I just, so the SLOs though, because one thing that you had explained in curriculum meeting I didn't quite understand fully beforehand is that the teacher writes it for each student, right?
Now what they write it for is a subject and/or a course that comprises at least 50% of their teaching responsibility. So it could be that one SLO would be written against a set of classes that they might have, for example. So they don't write individual SLOs for each kid, they write them for courses with rosters of kids in the SLO.
And then just make generalizations like X percentage of this roster will score over whatever in the English Regents?
You could do that. This district agreed to, this was part of collective bargaining, they had to agree to how to go about doing those metrics, and we came down to each student gets an individual target, not an individual SLO, just a target.
Right, a target.
I think that's the
Right,
distinction between the
yeah.
two things.
Okay.
You set a target for each student, but one SLO has all the kids on it.
So there is some specificity there to the roster.
That's
It's just
right.
that they meet that target.
That's right. But again, if you think about local norms and trying to establish and project how you think a particular student is going to do on an examination when you don't have any norms, you're not quite sure how the student's going to do. You it's kind of guessing. I mean, sophisticated guessing, but you're looking at, okay, how'd they do on their 3 through 8 English test? What were their scores like on their math test? What were their grades in English 9 and English 10? You use a kind of across-the-board analysis of what you think their reading and writing abilities are, and say, okay, based on that, I can reasonably predict that this student's going to get a 65 or better on the English regions, or 75 or better. That's pretty much how it's done. I monitored the slow help desk. I just want you to know in the district. I'm pretty good at managing slow help. It's one of my future jobs at State Ed, managing the slow help desk. Can't wait to answer the phone. Hello, State Ed, slow help. Wait to get that job someday. So this multiple measures thing against the 60% is basically pretty simple and straightforward, but it ends up having a lot of complexity in it, because basically what you have to do is observe using this evidence-based observation strategy that the State Education Department has put in place, and then they have to, out of 60 points, they get so many of those 60 points based on the observations. A probationary appointed year 1 teacher gets 3. They get 2 announced and 1 unannounced, and then a probationary year 2 and a tenure teacher gets 2, 1 announced and 1 unannounced. And then those 2 are averaged, and then you get so many points out of 60. And each one of the Danielson domains has a certain number of points tied to each of the 4 domains. And that's how they get those points. So that's the 60. So just a little bit about this assessment summary and the details and the comparisons. And then this should set us up there. We'll get started with this guy. And I'm going to find the summary document. Is this one? Okay. So this document kind of tells the big tale of this assessment thing in the district, which, and I know this is small across the top, I think you folks sitting there at the table might have these, but essentially what that is a listing of all the assessments that we give in the school district of one sort or another, and I'll just kind of tell you what they are. I'm getting old and blind, so I have to get closer. So if you look across the top, this is the dial screening. This is the kindergarten screening that all the kids get when they come into the school district. This is the Fountas and Pinnell screening that we do for ELA. And we do that K through 8, and obviously we do it with descending intensity as the students get older. We do it more when they're younger. And that basically measures the 5 major components of reading, of phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary fluency, and reading comprehension. There are a plethora of what I call CBMs, or curriculum-based measurements, across K-12. When you think curriculum-based measurement, think tests, quizzes, things that kids take in teacher-made tests, for example. Could be tests that are made by manufacturers of curriculum, one sort or another, like everyday math tests or whatever. Anything that is used in a curriculum to measure student performance. It is often the case that these curriculum-based measures are used for grading purposes. There's an awful lot of this kind of assessment that goes on. I think, as most of you parents know, that these kids are tested pretty regularly in the curriculum. We also have these MAPS assessments for ELA and math. We do that now K through 11. We have the New York State ELA in math, that's 3 through 8. We have the New York State Science, which is grade 4 and grade 8. We have these field tests, and those are sort of like the bad lottery. It's like, oops, your number's up, so now you have to fill this, and you never know. On kind of a rotating basis, and they interject them. They interjected a new interesting piece of information this year, where they really in earnest started to test kids in these 3 through 8 tests that I was talking about here, but they embedded field test items into the test. Okay? Because they think they get better statistically reliable information from each of those items. The problem was, the word on the street is they did something probably pretty boneheaded in the plan, which is that on day 2, for ELA, for example, I don't know, you might not have heard this, but there were 2 books that the kids had to do. There was a book 1 on day 2 and a book 2. It would actually be book 2 and book 3 in a 4-book sequence, if you think about it, because they tested on day 1, day 2, and day 3. Okay, so in day 1, which by the way took somewhere between, instead of taking 10 minutes of time to teach the kids the directions, it took more like 20, 25 minutes to tell the kids the directions. And they had to give the directions for the whole test sequence for both books at the beginning. Okay, that was the way it was set up. So the teachers dutifully did what they were asked to do. So the teachers worked like crazy on the first book, but through fatigue, exhaustion, running out of time, lack of stamina, whatever, they didn't finish the second book. And that was a broad problem in the industry. As a matter of fact, there were lots of just blank books at regional scoring, like boxes of them, as a matter of fact, because kids just didn't finish. Well, it turns out that all the field test items were on the first book, not on the second book. So all the items that actually counted on the test were in the second book that the kids never got to. So now you have a test design problem. So this is where this thing gets a little more complicated in terms of the statistics that are going to come out. This was sort of why I was saying before, I wouldn't want to be Pearson trying to figure out how to make these statistics, because that's what happened with this field test scheme that they came up with. So, and they're kind of sticking to this idea that they're going to use embedded field test items, and they're not going to tell us which ones are which. So we'll see how this plays out. But what I just told you is the word on the street about this thing. We have an awful lot of these district developed tests, and the only reason I distinguish this district developed test thing from curriculum-based metrics was that this district develop is now required for the APPR. So I tried to tease that out as a state-mandated, district-developed set of assessments against things like science 6 and 7, social studies 6 through 8, art, music, PE, family, home and career, and library. If you want to do something interesting sometime, sit with a chorus teacher and try to design an exit assessment for a chorus that's got 65 kids in it. It's quite fun. And harder than you think. So we have Regents English, Regents History, and so we've got our normal bevy of Regents exams, and I see it. It left me.
There it is.
Oh, it came back. I must have hit a button. So then Regents exams are all the way across here. You all know what those are. These RCTs, which are called Regents competency tests, those are old, what we used to call school level tests for a school level high school diploma. They were used for years for a safety net for students who couldn't pass Regents exams. Special education students would typically access those. The State Education Department is phasing those out. I think this is the last year they're administering them, so we'll no longer have those. And then obviously PSATs, SATs, AP exams. From time to time we have to administer the National Assessment of Educational Progress, otherwise known as the NAEPS. This last year I think we did them at grade, what did we do, 8? It depends. If you get snagged by the feds, then you have to do them. And then these things that are called the NISA-SLATs, which are the New York State English as a Second Language assessment tests. And then the LabR, which is just another diagnostic test for kids who come in the district who might not be English proficient. And we would have to evaluate their English proficiency and then determine whether they needed English language arts support of one sort or another. And then the NISA-SLAT stands as a proxy for their mastery of English, and they get 1 year, by the way, under the federal policy to learn English. Even if they're totally, let's say you're a native Spanish speaker and you do not speak English, you get 1 year, and then you have to start taking tests in English. That's the new rule. So that's another one of their strategies to guarantee equal outcomes, I guess. So that gives you a sense of the breadth of the assessments. So that might be a good place to stop. Other than I might say, I mean, I could go into those other charts that I've handed you, but it might be a good place to just say that what happened with the assessments this time around is you'll notice over the last 3 years on that one chart where I give the assessment detail, that was done at, I did that chart at Deirdre's behest just to kind of do a retrospective. I looked at 4 years back, I think, and so not only are the tests getting longer and harder and more difficult for the kids to pass, but we know less and less about those tests. because we used to have access to the tests, so we would be able to analyze how the kids did against the items and run what are called p-values against the item. So we could say, oh, look, a lot of our kids missed item number 2. They must have, why did they miss that anyway? And we could sit around and look at the curriculum and play with it. Well, now we can't even do that. So they've taken a lot of that away. So the tests are longer, they're harder, you don't have access to the stuff, they're using statistics that are not quite clear to all of us at this time. That pretty much sums up where we're at. I mean, I think that's the assessment picture.
Marvin, out of that several pages of tests that we just reviewed very quickly, can you point out for all of us which ones are directly the result of the Regents Reform Agenda? We know that the 3A tests themselves aren't new, but the tests, the actual tests themselves are new in that they're based on a Common Core standards that haven't been fully implemented across the state. There are others up there, for example, the NWEA math tests that we've never administered before. We are administering them primarily, or at least in part, because the state said that we have to either use a third-party test or develop tests locally or whatever, and we felt that we might be able to get the most bang out of the effort of doing that testing by using maps. Is there anything else up there, just to give the board members, to let them kind of hone in on what's been layered on top of what we've been doing for a number of years?
That district developed column is a direct result of the APPR demands, because that was one of the choices that we had to make to satisfy either the state or the local assessment accountability. So, and we were forced to have to do something for science and social studies particularly, but that was also true of those other disciplines there too. So that put a tremendous amount of demand on us. And in those cases, those tests mostly had to be written, so we had to write them and subject them to some kind of reasonable, review. So that was a layered on thing. I think that's pretty much it. Other than I would say there's a layered on thing that's kind of hidden underneath there, which is every single one of those tests across that Regents column are now used for annual professional performance review purposes. So that's new. I mean, it's one thing to say we've always done the 3 through 8 test. It's quite another to say now that counts as a percentage. So it's sort of interesting to me that now the Regents exams, you have to use them differently. So not only do we use them for this other purpose, we now have to use them for that purpose. A purpose for which, again, I mentioned, and I hope I didn't just fly by that, for which they were not originally designed. That is not why Regents exams were developed. None of this examination process in this country was ever developed for purposes of measuring the professional performance of the instructors. It was designed to measure the learning of the students. And now we're asking, we're loading up a lot of responsibility on these assessments.
And I'm not sure this is a question as much as an observation, but specifically with respect to the Regents, students often tutor or have tutors to prepare them for those tests. So how do you separate the effects of having a tutor from not having a tutor? You'd have to do it on a student-by-student basis. And how would you ever be able to do that reliably?
It's a wonderful question.